formed when George Edwards started the union at the Angel Hotel here in North Walsham. George was a staunch Methodist and he didn't want to be associated with alcohol. So he chose the Angel Hotel because it had an outside stairs that meant he didn't have to go through the bar and get mixed up with the alcohol to have his meeting. I'm afraid to say, today there are very few farm workers. The Crunch branch is the only one, and for the whole of North Norfolk we only have 70 members. We must look for other industries for support. It's well known the biggest industry in North Norfolk is due to the age of our local population. It is care homes, and I believe it's our interest to help wherever we can to see that workers in care homes are afforded the protection of a union. And I hope if anybody knows where there are people working in care homes, they will let the party know so we can help to get those into the union. If you're sacked even, you're still looked after. Just to finish off, I'd like to tell you a little joke. I often tell, I used to tell it to the students when I was teaching people to be part of the union in their workplaces. And it's this. There was a farm worker, his name was George. He'd worked for this old skinflint of a farmer for several years. Just as he was going home one Saturday, and I'm talking about Saturday because in them days you had to work on a Saturday. He was just going home and the old farmer come up with a bag and he said, "Here George," he said, "I got some for you and the missus for your Sunday lunch." Oh, George said, "What's that?" He said, "I got this here leg of mutton." "Oh," he said, "you can have that for your wife's lunch." So George strapped on the back of his bike and off he pedalled home. Come Monday morning, George pedalled back into the farmyard. The old farmer rushed over him, thought he was going to hear a good result. Rushed over him and said, "George," he said, how did you get on with that leg of mutton?" "Ah, master," he said, "that was just right." "Oh," the old man said to George, "how do you mean that was just right?" He said, "Well, that's like this here. If that had been any worse, we couldn't eat it. And if that had been any better, you bloody well wouldn't have given it to us." Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the night.
Good day out here in North Norfolk. We sometimes, I think, forget about you down in Norwich. And that's wrong of us. We're one big Norfolk Labour family, and we really appreciate the help that you have shown in the past to Norwich when you've come down to campaign and help, which you have. And I hope one day that we can repay the favour in a not too distant future. 100 years old. Wow. Now, I know a few things about Norwich Labour Party, but I've been reading your little pamphlet about the history of North Norfolk Labour Party, and it's fantastic, and it's given us ideas in Norwich about what we can do about our history, because history teaches you something. History shows you what is possible when people stand together collectively. I'll just tell you something. In America, they call the NHS a socialist healthcare system. It's an insult, but it's true. The NHS is the closest thing this country has ever seen to socialism. Why? Because it's not based on your ability to pay. It's not based on profitability, or at least it wasn't in its inception, as it may well be heading towards now. It's based on your need, and it is provided collectively. We pool our resources together as a community and look after one another, not based on profitability, but based on our healthcare needs. That is socialism. And if you like the NHS, you like socialism. Actually, a form of socialism that puts people and planet first. The survival of the human species into the 21st century. That is the socialism that we need. Capitalism does not have the solutions for the changes that we need to see, and the speed and the pace and the scale. It can play a part, but it does not have all the solutions. The climate change and the climate crisis is in effect the biggest market failure that has ever been seen by humanity. We know that the vast majority of carbon output and pollution is done by the top 20 or 30 corporations on the planet. You may have seen it in The Guardian. We know the top 10%, the wealthiest 10% of the population are responsible for 50% of all of the carbon and resources that are being used. Exactly. And of that 10%, the 1% are responsible for most of it. And at the other, to ensure that those trillions of dollars which are floating in offshore tax havens, which are being used to continue to deprive our planet of a sustainable future, that must be taken back under democratic control and used to make sure that we can decarbonise and rewild our economy in a decade. The market can't do that on its own. It's going to require us to do that. And some people say, well, this is impossible. It's never been done before. Well, you're wrong. Because back in the 1930s, someone called Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he wasn't a communist, he was a US Democrat. And he came to power in the 1930s. And on the first day of coming to power, he said, I am going to remove the gold standard in the US. This was a mechanism through which the banks and the capitalists are able to control the finances and the resources of the United States. And his advisor said, you can't do this. Anyway, you can't do it till it's Sunday. He said, I'll do it on Monday. They said, you can't do it on Monday. This is going to He said, shut up. He moved him aside. And on Monday, he axed the gold standard and moved America onto the current financial system that it is. And overnight, he took away the power of Wall Street and the banking system and brought it back under democratic control. He then used the power that he had, the monetary policy, that democracy, that the president and the Congress and the Senate then controlled to implement the New Deal. And arguably, I would say, stopped America from going down the road of fascism. In Europe, we didn't do that. In Europe, for most of Europe, we went down the path of fascism. And I'm going to finish on this here and say this. The values and principles that make us socialists and Labour Party members are also the values and principles that will navigate us through the stormy waters of the 21st. Because the climate shocks which are coming, whatever we do on decarbonising, whatever we do to try and change our economy and make it more fair, those climate shocks are coming. All we can do is build resilience economically, in terms of physical infrastructure, which you know about being on the coast, and global warming and climate change, but also democratically and psychologically. Resilience must be our watchword, because we know that in the last 5 or 6 years, with just 1 million to 2 million people being pushed out from Syria and North Africa, we have seen the European Union wobble and destabilise. We have seen the far right and the ethno-nationalists surge in France, in Germany, in Austria, in Hungary, in Poland. We thought we defeated them in 1945. We hadn't. They've simply been asleep. They're still there. And they can see that the climatic shocks that are coming, that have pushed a couple of million people, climate refugees, many of them, refugees of war, into Europe, it's arguably destabilised the European Union, arguably pushed this country onto the edge of Brexit and rolling out of the European Union. That's 2 million people. What happens when the climate shocks that the UN predicts that will happen if we go above 1.5 degrees, and even if we still hit 1.5 degrees centigrade? What happens when it's 10 million people on the move, 100 million people on the move, 500 million people on the move? What happens then? So we have to be prepared to ensure that our values, our principles as socialists, ensure that we not only elect a Labour government at the next general election, but that we make sure that Labour government is a transformative Labour government, that we learn the lessons of the past, that we understand we cannot build policies on a house of sand, that we have to have policies which fundamentally change the relationships of power in this country to ensure that working people are the ones that have the whip hand over the power structures of this country, because that is what socialism is about. It shouldn't scare anyone. It's democratic, it's good, and it works in the interests of the many not the few. Thank you very much.